Good morning. My name's Scott Galloway with NYU Stern School of Business and L2. I want to welcome you to the Generation Next Forum. This is the first and the last slide you'll see, I hope. There we go. These are our objectives. It's how you hold us accountable today for your investment in time and treasure. The first objective is to gain insight into tomorrow's affluent consumer, and the second objective is to inspire or to scare you to action. So Peter Drucker, who's considered the father of modern management, said that there's no great shift in business without an underlying shift in demographics. And the first generation we talk about as having a huge impact on the global business community was the greatest generation, a term coined by Tom Brokaw. And a lot of people argue around if that generation deserves that moniker. Was it their sacrifice during war that made them the greatest generation? Probably not. We lost 250,000 people as a nation in World War II. Russia lost 20 million, Germany 6 million, so our sacrifice wasn't nearly as great. Was it because of their physical or fighting ability? Probably not. To join the armed services, at the beginning of World War II, you needed to be above 5 feet tall, weigh over 105 pounds, and have 9 of your teeth, and 40% of American males did not qualify. However, what we had with the greatest generation, and what probably made them the most important generation to that point, at least in modern economic times, is they created a superpower. They returned from war. They went into a capital infrastructure that had been largely untouched, that had experienced tremendous infusion of innovation and the female workforce, and created a nation or an economic force known as the middle class that dominated the world economy for probably close to 30 or 35 years. And with that dominance and with all that optimism and economic power that came, they built huge lawns, they built separate houses for their cars, and they decided they wanted to have something called brands. And these brands gave them self-expressive benefit, gave them pleasure, and gave them a chance to reach out to the rest of the world and say, this is who I am, I'm successful. There's nothing like optimism to promote unprotected, sober sex, or specifically children. Right? The conscious decision to have children is the ultimate thermometer or litmus test having kids is the ultimate litmus test for optimism. And the greatest generation had a lot of kids, and this was the baby boom. And with their freedom afforded by their parents, they explored a lot of different. They went inward, explored a lot of different artistic expression, and ultimately decided to go shopping with their newfound economic wealth and became sort of the consumer generation, if you will. And just by virtue of their size, as they moved through society, they shaped it. We then got the Generation X. And I'm convinced that Generation X got a bit of a raw deal here because some demographer, probably a tenured professor somewhere, decided for some unknown reason that Generation X ended in 1977, which made them smaller and sandwiched between the larger baby boomers and Gen Y. And they were known as the slacker generation, not so much because of their ideals or their approach to work, but because they became of working age in 2 recessions and never got the kind of the same start or had the same impact as the baby boomers. And then we get to today's subject, Gen Y. And why is Gen Y so important? Well, based on their definition, most of whom will say it's being born between 1977 and 1994. There's just more of them. Size matters. As of this year, there's more Gen Y now than there are baby boomers. By 2017, their spending will eclipse those of baby boomers. And by 2015, they'll make over half the workforce. So to a certain extent, looking or understanding Gen Y is really understanding the future of business. It's the closest thing we have to a crystal ball around what's going to happen in terms of economic policy, business policy, social policy, et cetera. Now, what makes this cohort group different? One, they seem to have, obviously, a much greater comfort with technology. Their PDAs, their smartphones, video games seem to be almost an appendage. Two, they seem to have much more progressive ideals. They're much more comfortable with things ranging from gay marriage to immigration or what have you. And then finally, the way they approach relationships seems to be different. When asked who's the group they admire the most, it wasn't athletes, it wasn't endorsers, it wasn't celebrities, it was their parents. So will Gen Y in the US be the next big demographic force that shapes or reshapes the economy? Is this the next big deal that we'll look back and think it really changed everything? Probably not. It's probably going to be Gen Y, but it'll probably be Gen Y in China, where there's 250 million Gen Y. And wealthy households in China, as defined by the World Bank, if you look at those wealthy households versus wealthy households in Japan or wealthy households in the US, on average are occupied by people who are, again, on average 20 years younger than their counterparts in Japan or the US. So you have this wealthy, educated, and indulged $250 million pig in the python coming through the business society, coming through business and coming through our global society called the Chinese Gen Y. This is probably going to be the most powerful group or cohort in our modern economy. But most importantly, how does young affluence feel about prestige brands? We went out and we surveyed 500 young affluents, average age 28, who expect to make or are making 6 figures on an incredible professional trajectory, represented by 45 countries. Two-thirds of the sample size was the US. And we'll quickly go through the rankings. This is from last to best. We asked them if they hated a brand, indifferent about it, average, liked it, loved it. What's interesting here, and we don't have time to go over many of the observations, is that you'll see a disproportionate number of jewelry and watch brands towards the bottom. This is bad news for that industry. Most of these brands, Gen Y didn't even recognize. And then as you start to get through the middle of the ranking, and by the way, the ranking is in your program, you see some fairly well-known brands that you would think would have probably been higher, right? Brands like Louis Vuitton, number 20, Ralph Lauren, 25. And then finally, the top brands, right? A lot of fashion brands, some car brands, BMW, Mercedes, and Audi, and some newer brands, W Hotels, Marc Jacobs. For men are a little bit more simple. Men, it's really about boys and their cars. Although Ralph Lauren did pierce the top 10. So like any good study, what's really interesting is when you take the data and you start layering in additional data. So if you take on the x-axis, if you take the results of our study, and you look at the brands that were least liked or people didn't even know off the grid, and then you took the brands, the prestige brands that Gen Y loves, which we title Epic. That's your x-axis. And then on the y-axis, you took a sampling or you took a scale that tried to look at the relative value or relative size of each of these brands relative to their competitors, right? So this 45-degree line is naturally or logically where you would expect a brand to be plotted. And that is, if a brand is larger relative to its competitors and it has the resources and the brand acumen to do what every good brand manager is supposed to do and repopulate their brand with this new Gen Y consumer, right? You would think a larger brand ideally should have greater equity among Gen Y. And if it doesn't have equity, right? If it's high up on the size scale, but it's low on the Gen Y equity, that's what we would call a glass house, meaning that they're very vulnerable, right? Big business, but little equity with tomorrow's consumer is a very bad sign. On the other side of the spectrum, if you have a brand, a prestige brand that has a lot of equity, a lot of goodwill among Gen Y, but it currently has a small business, that's a good sign. That means they're punching above their weight class, that they're about to be spun around the moon and have incredible gravitational pull towards a bigger business. North Face had great technical credibility among mountaineers and at the same time managed to instill this incredible street credibility and goodwill among urban youth. It was punching above its weight class. And while it took 10 years to get to $30 million in the US, in 18 months in China, it went from 0 to $1 billion because it was punching above its weight class. It was a matter of time before that goodwill among a younger cohort translated into greater revenues. So who are some of these brands? So these are some of the brands we think are glass house brands, and that is that they're really vulnerable unless they make a concerted effort in an attempt to establish more goodwill among Gen Y, that they're vulnerable. And on the right side, these are brands that, again, we believe, have not reached their potential and are going to likely enjoy increased revenues over the next 10 to 15 years because there is this reservoir of goodwill waiting for them among the up-and-coming generation. So that's what today is really about. Today is trying to figure out how you become a brand that punches above your weight class as opposed to someone who's vulnerable and is in a glass house. And today's faculty consists of people who are either Gen Y influencers themselves, right? People who advise corporations on how to be more facile with Gen Y, and then finally some demos of people doing interesting things with interesting products around Gen Y. So let's get started.